The sun was setting over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across Shaquille O'Neal's sprawling mansion. The basketball legend sat in his home theater, scrolling through his phone when a video caught his eye. The shaky footage showed a homeless man being mocked and pushed away from a store entrance. The man wasn't asking for anything. He was just trying to get out of the rain. Shaq felt his heart sink as he watched. Growing up, his family had struggled too. There were times when his mom had to choose between paying bills and putting food on the table, but she never lost her compassion. "Baby," she used to tell him, "everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about." He couldn't stop thinking about that video. Here he was, sitting in a house with everything he could ever want, while people outside were being treated like they weren't even human. The comments under the video were worse. People laughing, making jokes, saying the homeless man probably deserved it. Pushing back from his custom-made chair, everything had to be custom when you're 7. Shaq walked to his trophy room. The gleaming NBA championships, the MVP awards, the Olympic medals, they were amazing achievements, but right now, they felt hollow. His mom's words kept echoing in his head. He picked up his phone again and called his friend who worked in special effects makeup for movies. "Hey, I've got a crazy idea," Shaq said, his voice filled with purpose. "I need to become someone else for a couple of days. Someone nobody would recognize." As he explained his plan, memories from his childhood in Newark flooded back. The times when neighbors helped each other out even though nobody had much to give. The community center that gave him a safe place to play basketball when his family couldn't afford any other activities. The kindness of strangers that helped shape who he became. Shaq walked to his window, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. Los Angeles looked beautiful from up here in the hills, but he knew there was another side to the city. People sleeping on sidewalks, families living in cars, veterans who'd served their country now being treated like they were invisible. He thought about his own kids and the lessons he wanted to teach them. It wasn't enough to just tell them to be kind. He needed to show them what that really meant. This wouldn't be like his usual TV appearances or commercials. This would be raw, real, and probably uncomfortable. Making his way to his home office, Shaq started making calls. He needed a small security team to watch from a distance. Being 7'1" meant he couldn't completely disappear, even in disguise. He needed cameras that wouldn't be obvious. Most importantly, he needed to make sure this was done right, with respect for the people whose lives he'd be stepping into briefly. As the plan came together, Shaq felt a mix of nervousness and determination. He'd faced tough opponents on the basketball court, but this would be different. He wasn't just going to observe. He was going to experience firsthand how society treats its most vulnerable members. And maybe, just maybe, he could use his platform to help change things for the better. "Mom," he whispered to himself, "I hope I can make you proud with this one." The makeup trailer was parked discreetly behind Shaq's mansion, away from any curious eyes. Inside, a team of professional makeup artists had been working for hours, transforming the NBA legend into someone unrecognizable. The process was painstaking. Every detail had to be perfect. "Hold still," the lead makeup artist whispered as she applied layers of carefully crafted prosthetics to change the shape of Shaq's face. They'd been practicing this transformation for days, figuring out how to alter his distinctive features without making him look artificial. Dark circles under his eyes, weather-beaten skin, and gray scattered through his beard, each detail adding years to his appearance. The biggest challenge wasn't just his face, it was his size. You can't exactly make a 7'1" man shorter, but they could change how he carried himself. They studied videos of elderly basketball players, noting how age and hard times had affected their posture. A slight stoop, a careful way of walking, clothes that hung differently on his frame. It all had to look natural. The wardrobe team had visited multiple thrift stores, carefully selecting items that would look worn but not costume-like. Each piece of clothing told its own story. The jacket with carefully mended tears, boots that had clearly seen better days, layers that someone living on the streets would actually wear for warmth and protection. As the transformation continued, Shaq stayed unusually quiet. He usually joked around during makeup sessions for commercials or movies, but this felt different. This wasn't entertainment. It was about understanding real people's lives. The weight of what he was about to do settled over him like a heavy blanket. "We need to think about your voice," the voice coach reminded him. They'd been working on changing his deep, booming tone into something softer, rougher, the voice of someone who hadn't had a real conversation in days. Shaq practiced speaking in this new way, stumbling over words until it started feeling more natural. The security team went over the plan one final time. They'd follow at a distance in unmarked cars, monitoring through tiny cameras hidden in Shaq's layers of clothing. If anything went wrong, they could reach him in seconds, but everyone knew that for this to work, they had to stay completely invisible. This wasn't about creating a viral moment. It was about experiencing the raw truth. Looking in the mirror for the first time after the transformation was complete, Shaq barely recognized himself. The person staring back at him looked tired, worn down by life, but there was still dignity in his eyes. He thought about all the people who'd look right through this person on the street, never knowing their story, never seeing their humanity. His phone buzzed. A message from his mom. "Remember who you are," she'd written, "and why you're doing this." Shaq took one last look at himself in the mirror before carefully putting the phone away. For the next 48 hours, he wouldn't be Shaquille O'Neal, basketball legend, and business mogul. He'd be just another homeless person on the streets of Los Angeles, invisible to most of the world. The sun was just starting to rise as the makeup trailer door opened. Shaq stepped out, already walking differently, his shoulders hunched against the morning chill. A few birds were singing somewhere nearby, and the city was starting to wake up. In a few hours, these streets would be full of people rushing to work, living their lives, making split-second judgments about the people they passed. "Ready?" asked the project coordinator softly. Shaq nodded, pulling his worn jacket closer around him. He was as ready as he'd ever be to step into a world that most people pretend not to see. The morning rush hour was just beginning as Shaq settled onto his piece of cardboard on the busy street corner. His hands trembled slightly as he held up the sign he'd made earlier, not from the cold, but from the strange feeling of being completely exposed yet totally invisible at the same time. The first hour was the hardest. A businessman in an expensive suit nearly tripped over Shaq's feet, muttering something under his breath about cleaning up the streets. A group of office workers walked by, clutching their coffee cups and actively looking anywhere but in his direction. It was like he'd become a ghost. People could see him, but they were trying their hardest to pretend he didn't exist. A lady walking her dog crossed the street when she saw him. The dog wagged its tail and tried to pull toward him, but she tugged it away firmly. Shaq couldn't help but think about his own dogs at home, how they always knew a good person when they met one. But right now, nobody was seeing him as a person at all. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the concrete beneath him started heating up. A group of high school kids walked by, pointing and snickering. "Look how tall that guy is." One of them laughed. Maybe he should try basketball instead of begging. The irony of their words hit him hard, but not as hard as the casual cruelty in their young voices. An older man shuffled past, himself looking barely better off than Shaq's current appearance. Their eyes met briefly, and the man gave him a slight nod, a tiny gesture of acknowledgement that nearly brought tears to Shaq's eyes. It was the first time in hours that someone had looked at him like a human being. The lunch rush brought a new wave of people, all in a hurry, all with somewhere important to be. A few dropped coins near him without stopping, without making eye contact. One person tossed a half-eaten sandwich his way, like feeding scraps to a stray animal. Shaq watched as a pigeon pecked at the bread, feeling his stomach growl despite the breakfast he'd eaten before starting this experiment. A street cleaner drove by, spraying water that splashed onto his cardboard and the bottom of his pants. The driver didn't even slow down or look back. Shaq had to resist the urge to stand up and say something, but that wasn't why he was here. He was here to understand, to feel what it was really like when the world decides you don't matter anymore. The worst part wasn't the people who were mean, it was the ones who looked afraid. A young mother pulled her curious child closer as they passed. An elderly woman clutched her purse tighter. A shop owner came out to spray the sidewalk in front of his store with a hose, making it clear that Shaq wasn't welcome there. Hours passed, and his back started aching from sitting on the hard ground. He thought about all the times he'd driven past people in similar situations, maybe feeling a moment of sympathy, but then continuing with his day. He'd donated to homeless charities before, but he'd never truly understood what it felt like to be on this side of the invisible wall that separated them from us. The sun was starting to get lower in the sky when he heard someone approaching. He kept his head down, expecting another person to walk past quickly. But these footsteps were different. They were slowing down, coming closer, stopping right in front of him. Shaq looked up slowly, not knowing that this next moment would change everything about his experiment. The footsteps belonged to a woman in a waitress uniform, carrying a paper bag and 2 cups of coffee. Her clothes were worn but clean, and her face showed the tiredness of someone who'd already worked several hours that morning. What struck Shaq most was how she looked directly at him, not through him, not past him, but at him. "I got an extra breakfast sandwich," she said softly, crouching down beside him. "And coffee. It's getting cold out here." Her name tag read Maria, and her hands were rough from years of hard work. She placed 1 coffee cup and the paper bag next to him, maintaining a respectful distance but not acting afraid. Shaq's throat tightened with emotion. "Thank you," he managed to say in his practiced rough voice. The smell of warm food reminded him that he hadn't eaten since early morning. "My father." Maria paused, adjusting her worn jacket. "He used to be out here too. Lost everything after the factory closed down. Took him 3 years to get back on his feet." She wasn't telling the story for pity. There was something else in her voice. Understanding. The breakfast sandwich was still warm, wrapped carefully in paper. Shaq took a small bite, and Maria smiled slightly. "Sometimes people just need a chance," she continued. "Dad always said the hardest part wasn't being hungry or cold. It was feeling invisible." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both sipping their coffee. Maria didn't rush, didn't act like she was doing some great charitable deed. She was just sharing a moment with another human being. "You're pretty tall," she observed casually. "Must be hard finding warm clothes that fit." Shaq nodded, fighting back the urge to reveal who he really was. This moment was too genuine, too precious to break. Maria checked her watch. Her break was probably ending. "I work at the diner down the block," she said, standing up. "They throw out good food at the end of each shift, if you're around at closing time." She left the offer hanging in the air, not making him feel like a charity case, just extending the simple kindness. As she turned to leave, she paused. "You know, my dad's doing good now. Has a job as a security guard. His own apartment." She wasn't just sharing information. She was sharing hope. Watching her walk away, Shaq felt overwhelmed by the simple dignity of the interaction. Here was someone who probably struggled to make ends meet herself, yet she shared what little she had. She didn't film it for social media, didn't brag about her good deed. She just saw someone in need and reached out. The coffee cup warmed his hands, and each sip reminded him of Maria's kindness. Other people walked by, still avoiding eye contact, still pretending not to see him. But something had changed. That single act of compassion had created a shield around him. Their indifference couldn't hurt as much now. He thought about all the Marias in the world, people who had their own struggles but still found room in their hearts to help others. People who remembered that everyone has a story, that everyone deserves to be seen. The breakfast sandwich was simple, just eggs and cheese on a biscuit, but it was served with something priceless: respect. As the morning crowd thinned out, Shaq carefully folded the paper bag and tucked it away. He'd eaten at the finest restaurants in the world, but somehow this simple breakfast meant more. Later, when this experiment was over, he knew he'd never forget Maria's quiet dignity, her gentle way of showing that kindness doesn't need an audience to matter. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Shaq felt nature's call growing more urgent. He'd been avoiding this moment, but there was no putting it off any longer. After carefully packing up his few belongings, he made his way toward a nearby restaurant. A clean-looking place with large windows and professionally dressed customers inside. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The cool air conditioning hit him immediately, along with the delicious smell of food. He had money in his pocket. Part of the experiment was to see how people would treat him even when he could pay. The hostess spotted him instantly, her welcoming smile vanishing as she took in his appearance. "We're full," she said quickly, despite the several empty tables clearly visible behind her. Shaq reached into his pocket for the money. "I can pay," he said softly. "I just need to use the restroom and maybe get some water." His throat was dry from hours in the sun. The manager appeared, a tall man in a crisp white shirt. "Sir, we have a strict policy. Restrooms are for paying customers only." Shaq held up the crumpled bills. "I understand. I'd like to buy something." The manager's face hardened. "We reserve the right to refuse service. Please leave before I call security." The other customers were starting to stare, some looking uncomfortable, others nodding in approval at the manager's actions. Shaq felt the humiliation burning in his chest. He'd been in this very restaurant before as himself. They'd treated him like royalty then. As he turned to leave, he noticed a young busboy watching the scene. The boy's eyes held something different. Not fear or disgust, but recognition of something wrong happening. As Shaq reached the door, he heard quick footsteps behind him. "Sir," the busboy called out quietly, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "There's a public restroom in the park 2 blocks down. Here." He pressed a cold bottle of water into Shaq's hands. "I'm sorry about." He gestured vaguely at the restaurant. "It's not right." The manager's voice boomed from inside. "Hey, get back to work." The busboy quickly squeezed Shaq's arm. "The park restroom is clean. They maintain it well." Then he hurried back inside, leaving Shaq holding the water bottle like a precious gift. Walking toward the park, Shaq thought about the courage it took for that young man to risk his job. The water wasn't just water. It was an act of rebellion against unfairness, a small stand for human dignity. The boy probably made minimum wage, but he had something the manager lacked: compassion. The park bathroom turned out to be exactly where the busboy said it would be. It was basic but clean, just as he promised. Shaq caught his reflection in the metal mirror. His makeup was holding up well, but his eyes looked different now. They held the weight of experiences he never thought he'd have. Standing at the sink, he watched other people come and go. A mother hurrying her children along, an elderly man in a business suit, a jogger stopping in quickly. None of them knew they were sharing this space with an NBA legend. None of them knew that their ordinary moment was part of an extraordinary lesson about humanity. The cold water from the bottle soothed his throat as he made his way back to his corner. He saved half of it for later, knowing now how precious each sip could be. The restaurant's windows gleamed in the distance, and through them, he could see people enjoying their meals, laughing, living their normal lives. He thought about the busboy, probably still cleaning tables, probably worried about getting in trouble, but hopefully knowing he'd done something good today. Sometimes, Shaq realized, the biggest people aren't the ones who stand tallest. They're the ones who bend down to help others stand up. As darkness crept over the city, Shaq felt a new kind of vulnerability settling in with the night. The streets that seemed merely unwelcoming during the day now felt dangerous. The crowds had thinned out, replaced by shadows and uncertainty. Even his impressive size didn't feel like protection anymore. If anything, it made him more noticeable. A police car cruised by slowly, its spotlight sweeping across his temporary spot. The officer inside gave him a long look, and Shaq's heart raced despite knowing he had security nearby. He thought about all the times he'd felt safe around law enforcement, how different it felt now, sitting here in torn clothes with nowhere to go. "You're in my spot, big guy," a gravelly voice said. Shaq looked up to see an elderly man in a worn military jacket, his white beard neatly trimmed despite his ragged clothes. "But you look new out here, so I'll share." The man carefully lowered himself to sit nearby, his movements suggesting old injuries. "I'm Tom," the man said, pulling out a thin blanket from his backpack. "Was a medic in Nam. Now I'm just a guy who knows where all the safe sleeping spots are." He spread the blanket out, offering half to Shaq. "Nights get cold, even in Leh." Tom's kindness caught Shaq off guard. Here was someone who had almost nothing, yet he was willing to share it with a stranger. "Rules of the street are simple," Tom continued, his voice low and steady. "Stay visible but not too visible. Keep your back to a wall. And whatever you do, don't sleep too deep." As they sat together, Tom pointed out things Shaq would have never noticed, which doorways were safer, which areas to avoid, which other homeless people could be trusted. "See that guy across the street? He helps people find shelters, but they're usually full. Lady with the shopping cart. She used to be a teacher before her mind started slipping. We look out for her." A group of rowdy youngsters passed by, throwing empty cans their way. Tom didn't flinch. "They'll grow up someday," he said quietly. "Maybe they'll remember being cruel and teach their kids better." There was no bitterness in his voice, just a tired wisdom. The night grew colder, and Tom shared stories between long silences. He talked about the friends he'd lost in Vietnam, the family who couldn't handle his PTSD, the system that was supposed to help veterans, but somehow left so many behind. "But I still love this country," he said. "Just wish it loved us back sometimes." Around midnight, a young couple walked by with leftover boxes from a restaurant. Instead of ignoring them like most people did, they stopped. "Would you like these?" the woman asked gently. "We couldn't finish." Tom thanked them with the dignity of a man receiving guests, carefully dividing the still warm food. "See," Tom said as they ate, "angels come in all forms. You just have to keep your heart open enough to recognize them." He didn't know he was sharing dinner with a famous athlete. To him, Shaq was just another soul who needed a friend on a cold night. As the city sounds quieted, Tom taught Shaq how to bundle up against the cold, how to use his backpack as a pillow while keeping it secure. "Sleep light," he advised. "And if you hear trouble, don't play hero. Just move on. Living another day is winning out here." Under the yellow streetlight, Shaq watched Tom settle into what was clearly a familiar routine. This man who'd served his country, who'd saved lives in war, was now teaching survival skills of a different kind. The concrete was hard beneath them, but Tom's humanity had made this harsh corner of the world a little softer, a little warmer, a little more bearable. The morning sun peeked over the city skyline as Shaq made his decision. After everything he'd experienced, the cruelty, the kindness, the raw humanity, it was time for the truth to come out. His heart pounded as he thought about the faces that had touched his soul over the past day and a half. First, he walked to the diner where Maria would be starting her morning shift. Through the window, he could see her tying her apron, probably tired from another early wake-up, but still ready to face the day with kindness. When she stepped outside to wipe down the outdoor tables, he approached slowly. "Good morning," he said, but this time in his real voice, deep, warm, and familiar to millions. Maria looked up, confused at first. Then Shaq carefully peeled away the prosthetic makeup around his eyes. Her hand flew to her mouth, the cleaning rag dropping to the ground. I don't understand," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. Shaq gently explained his experiment, his voice cracking with emotion as he thanked her for her kindness. "You didn't just give me food," he said. "You gave me dignity when most people wouldn't even give me a glance." Maria's tears flowed freely now. "I just did what anyone should do," she said softly. But they both knew that wasn't true. She'd done what few people had chosen to do. Other diner staff began gathering at the window, phones out, recording the incredible scene unfolding outside. Next, Shaq made his way to the restaurant from yesterday. The young busboy was just arriving for his shift when Shaq caught his eye. The boy froze, recognition dawning on his face as Shaq removed more of his disguise. "That water bottle," the boy started, his voice shaking. "Meant everything," Shaq finished. "You risked your job to show kindness to someone you thought was homeless." The manager from yesterday came running out, his face changing from anger to shock as he realized who was standing there. The boy stood taller, knowing his simple act of compassion had been right all along. Local news crews, alerted by the growing social media buzz, began arriving. But Shaq had one more person to find. He walked back to the spot where he'd spent the night, hoping Tom hadn't left yet. The veteran was there, carefully packing up his blanket. "Tom," Shaq called out, now fully himself again. The old soldier looked up, his weathered face registering surprise but not shock. He studied Shaq's face for a long moment before a small smile crossed his lips. "Figured you weren't really homeless," he said quietly. "But it didn't matter. Everyone deserves kindness." As cameras rolled and crowds gathered, Shaq pulled Tom into a gentle hug. "You served our country," Shaq said into the microphones that suddenly surrounded them. "Now you spend your nights helping others survive the streets. You're the real hero here." The story exploded across social media. Videos of Maria's tears, the busboy's proud stance, and Tom's dignified smile went viral. But more importantly, people began looking at their own behavior. How many times had they walked past someone without seeing them? How many opportunities for kindness had they missed? Through his tears, Shaq looked at the small group of people who had shown him humanity when they thought he had nothing to offer in return. Maria had shared her breakfast, the busboy had shared his courage, and Tom had shared his wisdom. They hadn't known he was Shaquille O'Neal. They had simply seen another human being in need. The story of Shaq's social experiment spread like wildfire across the country. News channels played clips of his revelations on repeat, social media exploded with reactions, and conversations started happening in homes, offices, and classrooms everywhere. But this wasn't just another viral moment. It was sparking real change. The restaurant that had turned him away faced an immediate backlash. People shared their own stories of being discriminated against, of being judged by their appearance rather than their character. The owner, feeling the pressure of public opinion, called a staff meeting. The young busboy who had shown kindness was promoted to shift supervisor, while the manager who had shown such cruelty was sent to mandatory sensitivity training. Local businesses began changing their policies. Restrooms for customers-only signs came down. Some cafes started suspended coffee programs, where customers could pay extra to provide free drinks for those who couldn't afford them. It wasn't solving homelessness, but it was creating small pockets of kindness in a harsh world. Maria's Diner became a symbol of compassion. People started coming from all over the city, not just for the food, but to meet the waitress who had shown such genuine kindness. She used her newfound platform to talk about her father's journey from homelessness to recovery, showing that with support and dignity, people could rebuild their lives. Television stations ran special reports about veterans living on the streets. Tom's story resonated deeply. A war hero who had saved lives, now living rough, yet still helping others survive. Veterans organizations reached out, offering services and support. But Tom's message remained simple. It's not about me. It's about remembering that every person on these streets has a story. The impact rippled through social media in unexpected ways. Instead of the usual challenge videos, people started posting about their experiences helping others. The Dignity Challenge went viral, people sharing stories of connections they'd made with those they might have previously ignored. Schools invited Shaq to speak about his experience. In gymnasiums across the country, he stood before students, not as a basketball legend, but as someone who had learned profound lessons about humanity. Your worth isn't measured by what you own, he would tell them. It's measured by how you treat people who can't do anything for you in return. City councils began receiving calls from concerned citizens. People wanted to know what they could do to help. Homeless shelters reported a surge in volunteers and donations. Local businesses started job training programs. It wasn't solving everything, but it was a start. A recognition that change begins with seeing people as people. The restaurant industry took notice too. Major chains started implementing new training programs focused on treating all customers with dignity, regardless of their appearance. Some restaurants even hired formerly homeless individuals as consultants, recognizing that their experiences could help shape more compassionate policies. But perhaps the most powerful impact was the quietest, the way people began to change their daily behaviors. More people started carrying extra granola bars or water bottles to share. Others began learning the names of homeless people in their neighborhoods, stopping to chat instead of hurrying past. The invisible wall between us and them began to crack, one small interaction at a time. 3 months after his social experiment, Shaq stood in front of a renovated building in downtown Los Angeles. The sign above read, "Second Chance Foundation." But this wasn't just another charity. It was a promise kept to the people who had touched his heart during those 48 hours on the street. Inside, Maria was training new staff members, teaching them the importance of treating everyone with dignity. She'd left her waitressing job to become the foundation's outreach coordinator, bringing her natural compassion and her father's inspiring story to help others. Everyone deserves a chance to be seen. She'd tell the volunteers, everyone has value. The young busboy who'd risked his job to show kindness now ran the foundation's job training program. He'd developed special partnerships with restaurants and businesses, creating opportunities for people trying to rebuild their lives. His own experience of standing up for what was right had shown him the power of believing in people. Tom had his own office too, though he rarely used it. Instead, he spent most of his time on the streets, finding veterans who needed help and bringing them in. The foundation had a special program for veterans, offering not just shelter and job training, but also counseling and community. No soldier left behind, Tom would say, even after they come home. The foundation wasn't just about providing services, it was about changing how people saw each other. The lobby featured a wall-sized photo from Shaq's experiment, showing him in his disguise. Below it was a simple question: would you have stopped to help? It served as a powerful reminder to everyone who walked through the doors. Every morning, the foundation served breakfast, but not in a typical soup kitchen style. Instead, they had small tables where volunteers sat and ate with the people they served. Conversation and dignity were just as important as the food. Breaking bread together breaks down walls, Shaq would say when giving tours to potential donors. The foundation's programs were different too. Instead of just offering handouts, they created opportunities for people to contribute their own skills and knowledge. A former teacher living on the streets now taught literacy classes. An artist who'd lost everything was helping design murals for the building. Everyone had something to give. One of the most successful programs started when Shaq remembered how Tom had shared his street survival knowledge. Now, people who'd lived on the streets were paid consultants, helping the foundation understand the real needs of the homeless community and training staff in outreach. Their expertise was valued and respected. The impact spread beyond Los Angeles. Other cities began copying the foundation's model, recognizing that treating people with dignity was just as important as providing services. Shaq used his platform to challenge other celebrities and athletes to spend time understanding the issues before trying to solve them. On this particular morning, as Shaq walked through the building, he stopped to watch a small scene unfold. A new person had walked in, looking scared and ashamed. Maria approached them with the same gentle kindness she'd shown him that morning with the breakfast sandwich. Tom offered a greeting that made them feel like a person, not a problem. The young former busboy was already heading over with information about job opportunities. Looking at all this, Shaq felt tears in his eyes. His 48 hours on the street had changed him forever, but more importantly, it had created a ripple effect of compassion that kept growing. The foundation wasn't just changing lives. It was changing hearts, one person at a time. "Remember," he whispered to himself, thinking of all the lessons he'd learned, "everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about." His mother's words had never felt more true.